The glass is shoved into your hand before you can refuse. Frost clings to the rim, biting your fingertips as hard as the wind tearing across the square. Your breath leaves in white bursts that vanish instantly into the night. All around you, the crowd presses tighter, their wool coats heavy with snow, their boots cracking ice with every shift of weight. The bottle tilts, and the liquid splashes, clear as fire, filling your glass to the brim. The smell stings your nose, sharp and chemical, cutting through the stench of smoke, sweat, and horse dung frozen in the street. Someone shouts the first toast. The words are slurred, but the crowd answers anyway, lifting their glasses high, a forest of trembling hands lit by torchlight. The flame bends in the wind, its glow bouncing off the faces around you. Red cheeks, raw lips, eyes too wide. The roar of voices collides with the sudden silence of snow. You tilt back the glass. It hits your tongue like a blade, first icy, then burning, then spreading down your throat, until your stomach feels as if it is catching fire. The man beside you coughs hard, spraying droplets into the snow at his feet. But no one flinches. Another man laughs too loud, spilling half his drink on his coat before clutching the rest as though it were gold. A woman in a threadbare shawl presses forward, her breath sour, begging for the bottle. A soldier hands it over with a grin, his boots caked with slush, his uniform torn at the elbow. Even in the chaos, there is order. The strong drink first, the weak wait. The bottle never lingers in one hand for long. Your teeth chatter, not from cold, but from the shock of heat rushing through your body. It feels like defiance, like spitting in winter's face. Around you, voices rise again. Another toast, this time for health, for survival, for outlasting the storm. But behind the cheers, you see a figure stumble. His knees fold, his glass falls, shattering against the stone. No one stops to help. They step over him as the bottle makes another round. You raise your glass for a second swallow, the fire calling you back. But in the corner of your eye, you see him lying still in the snow, his lips already blue, and you wonder, is vodka saving you tonight, or is it killing you slower than the frost? In Russia, vodka was never simply a drink. It was woven into the fabric of survival, especially during the endless winters that blanketed the land from the 18th century onward. In wooden villages where snow buried rooftops and froze wells solid, vodka stood in for medicine, food, and fire. The bottle was passed as often as bread, and sometimes it was all that remained when bread was gone. People believed it was not only warmth in liquid form, but a cure against the merciless cold. Apothecaries in Moscow and St. Petersburg prescribed vodka freely in the 1700s. Doctors swore it eased fevers, soothed frostbitten limbs, and fortified the body against bitter winds. Folk healers in Siberia rubbed it onto the chests of coughing children, while farmers mixed it with garlic to fight off illness. Soldiers carried it in tin flasks, as if it were a shield against the elements. To take a swallow before stepping into the snow was not indulgence. It was conviction. If the chest burned, then surely the frost had been kept at bay. Science would later unravel the illusion. Alcohol dilates blood vessels, creating the sensation of heat while in truth pulling warmth away from vital organs. To the body, it was deception. But in a land where winters devoured armies and smothered villages, belief mattered more than biology. Vodka was seen as armour, and armour, even imagined, was better than nothing. Travellers setting out on frozen roads rarely left without it. Before climbing into a sleigh, bound for another village or another market town, a man would take a swallow, sometimes two, as if sealing himself against the night. The ritual was so ingrained that refusing to drink before a journey was thought reckless, even unlucky. At the doorway, hosts offered a final glass, called Napoleonic, for the road a liquid prayer, for safe passage through storms, and the wolves that haunted the snow. The state recognized vodka's hold. In the 18th century, taxes on vodka filled the coffers of Tsars. In the 19th century, imperial soldiers were issued vodka rations during campaigns, particularly in the frozen winters of the Napoleonic Wars. They called it courage in a bottle. In a bottle. By the time of the Great Patriotic War in the 1940s, Stalin himself ordered vodka rations for Red Army soldiers, a ritual sip before men hurled themselves against the German front. Commanders called it liquid strength. Soldiers called it the only warmth they had. The irony remained. What was believed to save lives often ended them faster. Men stumbled into snowdrifts, lulled by false heat, and never woke. Families lost fathers to frost, their last memory being the bottle that had promised protection. Yet, for centuries, the contradiction hardly mattered. In Russia, where winters could crush crops, starve families, and freeze men where they stood, vodka was never questioned. It was survival, even if survival was only illusion. Hospitality in Russia has always been a matter of life and death, especially in winter. To open a door and let the cold in was dangerous, but to leave a traveller outside was unthinkable. Inside the warmth of a peasant hut or the grandeur of a noble estate, vodka was the threshold between stranger and guest. To offer it was to offer protection, and to refuse it was to risk offence so grave that it might outlast the snow itself. By the 19th century, the ritual had become as fixed as the frost. A guest crossing the threshold was greeted with a tray holding vodka, dark bread, and salt. Bread symbolized nourishment, salt was purity, and vodka was fire. Together, they declared, "You are welcome, you are safe." The ritual was so ingrained that foreign travellers, from French envoys to English merchants, wrote in their journals of being pressed to drink immediately upon arrival. Declining was nearly impossible, for to reject the glass was to reject the hand that offered it. The winter deepened these customs. In villages across Siberia and the Urals, travellers wrapped in fur-lined coats and scarves were led inside and sat close to the stove. A glass of vodka was set before them, often poured straight from bottles pulled from snowbanks where they had been kept chilled. Toasts followed, each one a small shield against the dangers outside. First to health, then to family, then to safe passage. The rhythm of toasting was itself a ritual, punctuating conversation with burning swallows that steadied nerves and sealed trust. Among peasants, the farewell was as important as the greeting. When a guest rose to leave, the host would pour a final glass called Napoleonic, literally, for the staff, the walking stick. It was meant to steady the traveller's steps, to guard him from frostbite and wolves. Even the poorest household found a way to provide this last drink, for to let someone depart without it was to send them into danger, unblessed. Foreign observers noted the ritual with fascination, sometimes with alarm, yet they too found themselves taking the glass, for refusal seemed almost as perilous as the road itself. The nobility echoed these traditions with greater ceremony. In the great halls of St. Petersburg, crystal decanters glittered on silver trays, vodka poured into glasses, engraved with imperial crests. Guests toasted to the Tsar, to Russia, to endurance through another winter. Musicians played, candles burned, and laughter rang out. But at the centre of it all was the same glass, clear and burning, linking aristocrats to peasants, Moscow to the steppe. Vodka was the common denominator of hospitality. It closed distances, bridged suspicions, and turned the frozen Russian winter into a place where a stranger might survive the night. Yet beneath the ritual of warmth was an unspoken truth. To drink was not simply to join in welcome. It was to bind yourself, however briefly, to the rules of a country where the bottle was as powerful as the hearth. No Russian winter could be told without its wars, and no Russian war without vodka. From the retreat of Napoleon's Grande Armée in the early 19th century to the frozen trenches of the Great Patriotic War in the 1940s, vodka was carried into battle as both ration and ritual. Soldiers swore it steadied their nerves. Commanders swore it bound men to duty, and the state swore it was as essential as bread. When Napoleon's troops staggered through the snow in the winter of 1812, Russian soldiers marched beside their sleighs and cannon, pulling from flasks that steamed in the cold air. Accounts from the campaign describe officers pouring vodka before charges, raising toasts to the Tsar and to survival. The drink was said to make men fearless against cavalry, to warm them when fires failed, to stiffen resolve when frostbite blackened their feet. It was more than superstition. It was discipline, disguised as ritual. By the late 19th century, vodka rations had become institutional. Tsarist officers distributed daily measures, especially in winter, calling it frontovoye vino, wine of the front. The ration was not only meant to steady hands against rifles, but to keep morale from freezing solid. The burn of vodka, shared in the trenches, was believed to level differences between peasants and nobles, officers and recruits. A glass in the snow was proof that the war belonged to all of them. In the 20th century, vodka's role in war reached its height. During the Second World War, Stalin ordered what became infamous as the 100 grams of courage. Red Army soldiers were issued a daily ration of 100 grams of vodka, especially before attacks in the winter months. Memoirs from the Eastern Front recall men huddled in foxholes, passing canteens as the snow fell, their nerves burning with liquid fire. For many, that swallow was the only warmth they would feel before hurling themselves against machine guns and artillery. Yet the ritual was double-edged. Some soldiers drank too much, stumbling into combat dazed. Their courage blurred into recklessness. Others became dependent, waiting not for the bugle or the command but for the bottle. Commanders both feared and relied upon it. The drink that made men brave also made them weak. But in a war where temperatures dropped to 30 degrees below freezing and food was scarce, vodka seemed less a vice than a necessity. Foreign observers marvelled and scoffed. German officers in the Second World War mocked the Red Army as drunkards, only to discover that vodka kept Russian soldiers in the fight when hunger and cold should have broken them. Western journalists, visiting Moscow during the war, wrote of toasts raised in candlelit rooms, even as bombs fell outside. Vodka became a weapon in its own right, part of Russia's legend of endurance. It was courage, ritual, and illusion. On the battlefield, vodka could make men feel immortal, even as the snow proved them mortal still. Long before doctors prescribed vodka as medicine or generals rationed it as courage, the Russian winter already had its spirits. Among them was Morozko, the frost demon, a figure both feared and respected in folklore. He was said to prowl forests and fields when the snow lay deep, freezing those who showed disrespect, sparing those who honoured him. In villages where stories carried as much weight as prayers, vodka became part of the offering. A splash on the ground for Morozko, a swallow for the living, and the hope that the demon would pass by without claiming another soul. Winter nights in the countryside were filled with these rituals. Around stoves, families told tales of travellers who failed to show reverence and were found stiff as wood in the morning, their faces glazed in ice. Children were warned never to mock the cold, for Morozko was listening. To pour vodka onto the frozen earth was both a bribe and a plea. The earth drank for him, and so he left the household untouched. It was a small cost, measured in drops, against the fear of losing an entire family. Vodka also played a role in the rituals of death. In Orthodox tradition, mourners brought food and drink to the graves of loved ones, especially during the harsh months when the ground was too hard to dig deep. Bottles of vodka were cracked open at funerals in January or February. The sharp liquor poured not only into glasses, but onto the soil itself. To drink beside the grave was to keep the dead warm, to bind the living and the departed through fire against frost. Foreign travellers in the 19th century often wrote of these scenes with astonishment, noting how mourners drank heavily in the cemetery itself, sometimes leaving half-empty bottles stuck upright in the snow like crude monuments. Not all folklore cast vodka as protection. Some stories warned it was a trickster, a spirit disguised in liquid form, luring men to dance with death. In Siberia, legends told of hunters who drank too much before venturing into the taiga, convinced they felt invincible. They mocked Morozko, daring him to try, and were found days later, frozen stiff, their rifles still clutched in their hands. These tales circulated in whispers, reminders that vodka was no true shield, only an illusion of warmth. Yet the rituals endured. Even in the 20th century, soldiers in the Red Army were known to pour a drop onto the ground before raising their glasses, invoking old customs without realizing they were echoing ancient fears. Vodka was fire against the frost, but it was also a bridge to the unseen. To drink in winter was to acknowledge the thin veil between life and death, warmth and cold, man and demon. And in every swallow there was a question. Were you drinking for yourself, or to keep something else at bay? For peasants in the Russian countryside, vodka was more than ritual. It was the daily fire in the hearth, the comfort against hunger, the silence breaker in rooms where winter stretched too long, when the wind pressed snow against the wooden walls of an izba, when the oven was the only source of warmth, and when the night seemed endless. The bottle was placed at the centre of the table. It dulled the aches of labour, softened quarrels into laughter, and made the long dark hours pass a little quicker. Travellers in the 19th century often described stepping into peasant huts and finding families crowded around the stove, a bottle open, glasses clinking. Vodka was poured for men first, but women drank as well, their cracked hands still raw from laundry or fieldwork. Children, too, sometimes tasted it, a few drops rubbed on gums or sipped from a spoon to quiet coughing fits. For a people who lived close to the edge of famine, vodka was cheaper than meat, easier to find than medicine, and more reliable than warmth from firewood that burned too quickly. But what gave relief also brought ruin. Wages earned in fields, mills and factories too often vanished into taverns before bread could be bought. In Moscow and provincial towns alike, cheap vodka shops multiplied in the 1800s, their signs swinging in the snow, their floors sticky with spills. Accounts from the time describe workers handing over nearly entire pay packets in exchange for bottles, leaving wives and children with nothing but hunger and cold. Domestic violence swelled in these winters, tempers sharpened by liquor, frustration, and poverty. Orthodox priests railed against it from pulpits, calling vodka the devil's tool. Government officials worried over the productivity of peasants and workers lost to drunkenness. Yet at the same time, vodka sales filled the Tsar's treasury. The state itself was one of the largest distillers, making addiction both a personal tragedy and a national policy. To drink in a peasant hut was not only a family choice, it was part of a system that traded warmth for loyalty, numbness for obedience. Still, for the peasants themselves, vodka was not seen as curse, but as necessity. It loosened frozen joints, calmed anxieties about debts and harvests, and turned unbearable winters into nights filled with song. Folk songs themselves often praised vodka as the poor man's friend, the only companion that never betrayed him. Glass after glass, peasants raised their toasts, half in defiance of the frost, half in surrender to it. In the glow of the stove, with shadows flickering on log walls, it was easy to believe vodka was fire itself. Yet when morning came, hunger returned, wages were gone, and children cried for bread. The hearth had warmth, but the warmth came at a cost that grew heavier with each winter past. In Russia, drinking was never only about warmth or welcome, it was also a test. To raise a glass of vodka in winter was to measure not just appetite but strength, toughness and endurance. Among men, it became a performance of masculinity, a way to prove who could outlast the others, who could swallow glass after glass without flinching, who could step into the snow bareheaded and laugh at the cold. By the 19th century, foreign observers were already describing these contests with fascination and alarm. English merchants travelling through Moscow wrote of banquets where vodka flowed in endless rounds, each toast followed by another, each refusal met with mockery. To drink, without pause, was to display honour. To set down a glass untouched was weakness. The ritual carried into villages as well, where workers leaving taverns plunged their hands into snowbanks, or walked coatless into the night to show their resilience. The crowd cheered them on, their laughter mixing with the wind, until one man staggered and fell, his pride dissolving into the frost. These trials were not confined to peasants or labourers. Nobles, officers, and even Tsars participated in endurance drinking as public spectacle. Chronicles from the 18th century record grand feasts at the imperial court, where courtiers were expected to keep pace with their ruler's glass. Peter the Great was infamous for demanding that foreign envoys match him drink for drink, a challenge few survived without humiliation. For him, vodka was not simply hospitality, it was a test of loyalty, submission, and strength, wrapped in ritual. In the countryside, endurance drinking often spilled into danger. After wedding feasts in midwinter, it was not uncommon for young men to wander half-dressed into snowdrifts, daring each other to last the longest. Some returned laughing, others froze to death before dawn. Local folklore turned these deaths into cautionary tales, warning that vodka and frost together demanded respect. Yet the rituals persisted, for the line between bravery and recklessness was often blurred by intoxication. By the 20th century, such contests had become woven into Russian stereotypes abroad. Western journalists wrote of soldiers who could drink a bottle of vodka in one sitting and still march into the snow. Popular caricatures depicted Russians as half immune to alcohol and cold alike, as though endurance itself were their national character. Inside Russia, the legend was both embraced and resented. To prove oneself with vodka was still a point of pride, but it also carried shame. When the drink laid men low, their endurance exposed as illusion. The ritual of endurance was more than a game. It was a performance of identity. To drink was to show you belonged. To stumble was to admit weakness. Winter was merciless, and vodka turned that mercilessness into theatre. The cold did not forgive, but the crowd cheered anyway, as though applause could keep a man standing when his knees gave way. Vodka was not only a peasant's fire or a soldier's courage, it was the empire's treasury. From the 17th century onward, the Russian state recognized that what warmed the body could also fill its coffers. Taxes on vodka became one of the crown's most dependable revenues, a steady stream of rubles that grew stronger with every long winter. To drink was not only a personal choice, it was an act that tied the peasant hearth, the officer's mess, and the Tsar's palace into the same system of profit and control. By the 18th century, distillation itself had been centralized. Private stills were often outlawed, and taverns known as kabaks sprang up under state sanction. These establishments, sometimes the only gathering places in remote villages, were designed to serve not community, but revenue. The more peasants drank, the more the treasury swelled. Chroniclers wrote that in some provinces, nearly half of the government's annual income came directly from vodka sales. Winter, when demand surged, became the crown's most profitable season. The system created tension that reached every level of society. Priests condemned drunkenness from their pulpits, yet their parishes could not escape the lure of the kabak. Local officials decried disorder in the streets, but they themselves were often found raising glasses in the same taverns. Families begged men to save their wages for bread, but the state pressed them toward the bottle knowing that each coin dropped on the counter fed the imperial budget. Even in times of war, vodka was used as both weapon and tether. During the Napoleonic invasion in the early 19th century, vodka rations were issued not only to steady soldiers but to reinforce loyalty. A soldier might doubt his officer, but he did not doubt the bottle. A century later, under Stalin, the daily 100 grams of courage served the same purpose, binding men to the state by fire in their throats as much as by fear of their commanders. Attempts at reform often faltered. In the early 20th century, Tsar Nicholas II briefly introduced prohibition during the First World War, believing that sobriety would improve discipline and productivity. The result was chaos. Illegal stills multiplied. Soldiers rioted, and the treasury starved. By the time the Soviet Union rose from the revolution, vodka was once again state-controlled, this time under a monopoly that stretched across the entire nation. Lenin condemned drunkenness, but his government could not survive without the revenue. Stalin embraced it fully, turning vodka into both a patriotic symbol and a financial lifeline. For centuries, the state's hand guided the bottle. Vodka was not only ritual, it was policy. Every glass poured in a peasant hut, every toast in a noble hall, every ration on the battlefield tied the people to their rulers. Winter made men thirsty, and the state turned that thirst into power. Vodka did more than warm bodies. It built legends. By the 19th century, stories of Russians drinking themselves impervious to frost had spread across Europe. Foreign visitors marvelled at peasants, trudging bare-chested through snow after swallowing glass upon glass. Their laughter carried on winds that would have felled other men. Soldiers were described as marching longer, fighting harder, and enduring cold that should have crippled them, all because of vodka's fire. These tales fed into a myth of invincibility, as though Russia's true winter uniform was not wool or fur but a bottle. Travellers' accounts often exaggerated, but they were rooted in reality. In Moscow taverns, men routinely stepped outside after long nights of drinking, their coats flung open, their breath steaming. Some returned at dawn boasting of their strength. Others were found frozen stiff. The contrast between survival and death only deepened the allure. To drink and endure was heroic. To drink and collapse was tragedy, but one that fed the myth even further. Outsiders repeated these tales until Russians themselves began to embrace them as proof of their unique endurance. In the army, the myth took on official weight. Commanders of the Tsarist era and later Soviet officers leaned on vodka to foster morale. They claimed it gave soldiers not only courage, but physical resistance to frost. The ritual of drinking before battle became entangled with identity itself. A Russian soldier did not fear the cold, because vodka was his shield. The myth grew so powerful that even German officers during the Second World War remarked, half in scorn and half in respect, that their enemy could fight through blizzards on nothing but bread crusts and vodka. But beneath the myth lay grim truths. Vodka did not stop frostbite. It dulled pain, blurred judgment, and tricked men into feeling warm while their bodies cooled to lethal levels. Doctors recorded countless deaths from exposure linked directly to overdrinking, especially during winter marches. Peasants who staggered into snowdrifts rarely rose again. Soldiers who stumbled off the march line froze where they fell, their comrades too exhausted to carry them. Yet the legend endured, because it made suffering seem like strength. Culturally, the myth was also a form of pride. Russians faced a climate that foreigners could scarcely imagine. To claim that vodka made them stronger than the frost was to turn hardship into identity. The burning glass was a badge of belonging, a way of saying that what killed others made them Russian. The more the outside world repeated the caricature of the hard-drinking, frost-proof peasant, the more it was embraced inside Russia, half in jest, half in truth. The myth of invincibility was both shield and trap. It gave men courage, but it also lured them to overstep the line between survival and ruin. Vodka could make a man laugh in a blizzard, but laughter did not always last until dawn. Vodka rituals did not vanish with Tsars or Soviets. They survived, reshaped, but unbroken, into modern Russia. Even now, when central heating hums in city apartments and electric lights push back the dark, winter still summons the bottle. A New Year's table is not complete without vodka. At its centre, glass is raised in endless rounds of toasts, to health, to family, to memory, to endurance, through another year of frost. The ritual repeats itself, as old as snow. In rural villages, echoes of older customs remain. Travellers still take Napoleonic before leaving, the final glass at the doorway for safe passage through icy roads. At funerals, mourners pour vodka onto the earth or onto the grave itself, believing the fire will warm the dead, just as it warms the living. Bottles are sometimes left upright in the snow, a silent offering to ancestors, a gesture that looks almost identical to scenes described by travellers in the 19th century. Hospitality still carries its weight. To refuse a glass of vodka offered by a host is awkward at best, insulting at worst. Guests are expected to join in the ritual, even if only with a sip, for the drink binds people together. In cities like Moscow or Petersburg, businessmen toast deals over vodka, just as peasants once toasted safe journeys. Weddings are marked by rounds of toasts that blur into dawn. The rituals remain familiar, even as the world around them has changed. The state's relationship to vodka also lingers. Modern governments have tried to regulate, tax, and reform drinking habits. But vodka's place is too deeply rooted. Campaigns against alcoholism have come and gone, yet the bottle retains its symbolic power. For many Russians, it is not simply a drink, but an inheritance, a cultural anchor passed down through centuries of frost and famine, feast and war. And so, the contradictions endure. Vodka remains warmth and danger, ritual and ruin, myth and memory. It links the peasant hut to the palace, the soldier's trench to the banquet hall, the 19th century to the 21st. To raise a glass in winter is to join a chain that stretches backward through time, each toast echoing centuries of survival and loss. The snow outside may now be ploughed by machines, the wolves long gone from the roads, but the ritual has not disappeared. Vodka remains the fire of Russia's winter, a flame that burns as fiercely in memory as it does in the throat. Step back from the taverns and trenches, from the frostbitten roads and candlelit tables. What remains is not only the story of a drink, but of how a nation wrapped its survival around ritual. Vodka in Russian winter was never just liquor. It was a symbol, a weapon, a comfort, and a curse. It promised warmth while stealing it away, promised courage while eroding strength, promised community while draining families of bread. Yet still the glass was raised, over and over, through centuries of snow. The rituals gave shape to the cold. A splash for Morozko, a glass before a journey, a toast in the trench before battle. They were small acts, yet each carried a weight far beyond its measure. To drink was to endure, and to endure was to belong. Foreigners may have called it excess or folly, but inside Russia, vodka was folded into the rhythm of winter itself. Without it, the season felt incomplete, as though the fire had gone out of the hearth. History shows the contradictions clearly. Tsars taxed it, priests condemned it, soldiers relied on it, peasants surrendered to it. The Soviet state rationed it. As courage, families poured it into graves. Artists sang of its friendship while warning of its ruin. Across generations, vodka was accused of destroying households, yet celebrated as the one companion that never abandoned its people in the cold. It was both scapegoat and saviour. Today, its rituals remain, softened by time, but not erased. A toast at New Year's, a final glass before leaving a house in winter, a bottle shared at a grave. The snow still falls, and the glass is still raised. The myths endure because they are woven into memory, into survival, into what it meant and still means to be Russian in the face of endless frost. Perhaps that is vodka's truest legacy. Not its taste, not its burn, but the story it tells about resilience and illusion, about warmth that flickers in the glass, even as the cold closes in. And so the question lingers. Was vodka ever truly a shield against winter? Or was it only a fire borrowed from the frost, burning bright for a moment, before fading back into the snow?